It is now my pleasure to introduce a familiar face, Jacob Frey, the mayor of Minneapolis. Since his election in 2017, Mayor Frey has made addressing Minneapolis' affordable housing crisis his top priority. In his first year, he successfully advocated for a record-setting $40 million investment in the city's affordable housing efforts, signed a landmark comprehensive plan into law, and fast-tracked his stable homes, stable housing initiatives. Mr. Mayor, welcome.
Thank you.
And another familiar face, Lisa Bender, president of the Minneapolis City Council. Since her first election in 2013, Ms. Bender led the recent City Council adoption of the Minneapolis 2040 Plan, authorized the city's inclusionary zoning policy, and the city's accessory dwelling unit ordinance. Council President Bender, great to have you with us. And Steve Clemons.
I've been told to take this away from you.
There we go.
I'm going to give it 2 mics. There you go. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. We have been talking about housing all morning, affordable housing, how to change the curve that Minneapolis is on, because we just heard from the minority leader in the Minnesota House about the state being 51st in the nation when it comes to this problem. So let me just start out. Mr. Mayor, what are you doing to fix it?
Well, we collectively are doing a whole lot. When you look at the affordable housing crisis, generally I divide it into two different subparts to fix it. The first is subsidy, bridging that gap between whatever constitutes the market rate and the affordable rate. We're doing a whole lot there. In fact, we've invested record amounts, 3 times the previous record, in affordable housing to the tune of $40 million, with a real focus on low-income housing and housing for people that are experiencing homelessness. And it's not just the focus on the subsidy, it's also making sure that we have affordable housing in every corner, in every neighborhood of our city. And we're making a big push for that. And in fact, just recently, the council allocated $18 million to 12 different projects throughout the city. And so we're stepping up to make sure that we're doing our part.
So before I jump over to Lisa, is that enough? Do you have enough resources? Mohammed Noor was just up here saying they were in the last state session trying to get $150 million, got something like $60 million. He said this is not yet moving with the resources it needs, but you sound happy with the resources you have.
No, we don't have anywhere close to enough funding. The $40 million was city money. Now, it used to be, if you go back to the 1980s, that we used to get significant federal funds to do affordable housing, significant federal funds to do public housing. Those funds have largely dried up. Whether that's low-income tax credits or community development block grants, those funds have dried up, and we at city levels have been, when you push it under the rug, like the controversy and the difficulty and the funding, we're what's under the rug. And we've had to pick up the slack in a big way. And, thankfully we are, but we need partners at both the state and federal legislature as well.
Lisa, what's your dashboard on this? And I know that you've been leading on the Minneapolis 2040 project. But what, let me just make it tough for you for a minute. Sure. What are you failing at right now that you have to get right?
Yeah, I think collectively across the country, we need to radically rethink housing as public infrastructure. We collectively, private and public sectors, provide transportation systems, we provide energy systems, we provide water systems, and housing has just been forgotten. And it's been both highly regulated in a way that benefits those with the most privilege and power, and it's also just forgotten in terms of public investment. The federal government walked away from public housing when I was a toddler. And so now, as a city council member, now in my early 40s, we've inherited a system that both, for decades has privileged those with the most and forgotten the people that we really have left behind. And housing is inextricably linked with income, with all these other systems that are failing, especially in Minnesota, people of color. As homelessness rises across the state, we have an eviction crisis, we have a rising homelessness crisis. Homelessness is up 10% statewide, even more in the metro. But the disparities that we see in race are striking. If you're a Native American person, you're 27% more likely to experience homelessness, as would be expected by the population. Black people are experiencing homelessness at 5%, 5 times more the rate, 27 times, 5 times more the rate as the population. And so when we talk about housing in Minnesota and Minneapolis, we can't we have to talk about race as well.
When I'm interested because you're both what I call, very high-level urban practitioners, right? You are thinking about how to run a city together. Do you see other examples out there that are sort of your North Star? That I often do speak with mayors and mayors from all different parts of the country, and they have show and tell moments where you see something great happening in one area and they share it with another. But do you see anyone that you admire elsewhere in the nation that is getting the equities right and the balance between the private sector and the regulators and the different communities that you think would be a model for Minneapolis?
I think we're on the leading edge of a group of cities and states that are really combining loosening these regulations that, again, have really benefited folks with the most, and adding in layers of renter protections, looking at rent increase caps, looking at supporting legal protection for low-income renters. To me, they have to go hand in hand. And also looking at the income side. When you look at neighborhoods across the city of Minneapolis and you see, what neighborhoods are affordable to people by race, you see, over time, it has become less and less affordable, in part because housing costs have risen, but income has dropped so dramatically, especially for people of color in our community. And so that's why we raised the minimum wage locally, $15. Right. So I think, the cities of Philadelphia, New York City, California cities, the state of Oregon, with Portland really pushing and leading, we are all kind of working together, I would say. We talk all the time. Even folks, in Austin, which has heavy state preemption with a lot of things that we all want to do, we're talking with each other, and we're part of, I think, a cohort.
I was with the mayor of Seattle the other day, and she's struggling with the same sort of issues. But Mayor, you're North Stars in this?
Well, I think Council President is exactly right. There's a lot of camaraderie in cities right now because we have kind of become these laboratories of democracy where we're trying new things, we're thinking outside the box, and yes, we're pressing the envelope. And while there are kind of a menu of options that I look to other cities to check out, I gotta say, when I talk to other mayors throughout the country, they're envious of a lot of the work that we've done here. And whether that's around subsidy for affordable housing, the amount of money we're putting in, or that's around the comprehensive 2040 plan that we've been working on, or stable homes, stable schools, we have said from the very beginning that housing is a right, that everyone should have that safe place to go home to at the end of the night to rejuvenate for the next day. And we're putting our money where our mouth is on the topic.
Well, I know Stable Homes, Stable Schools is your marquee initiative in this area. Can you explain it to our? We have a lot of people watching online as well, but explain us to the building blocks of what you're doing with Stable Homes and Stable Schools.
I can. We recognize that around 7% of our Minneapolis public school age population is experiencing homelessness. An even higher percentage is seeing severe housing instability. So in other words, these kids are moving between schools twice and 3 times and more per year.
Can you give us a numeric, so 7% equals how many families roughly?
I mean, we're looking at thousands of kids, and that are experiencing homelessness or severe housing instability in some form. And so what we're doing is making sure that these kids have access to a stable home, hopefully within a certain radius of their school. Because I mean, like you hear about all the problems in the school, and you can't put it all on the teacher. These kids aren't walking into the classroom as a blank slate. They're coming in with all of the successes and failures of society, and so some of those failures we can help account for. And so what we're doing is stepping up to provide them that home, working with several different jurisdictions and our nonprofit community as well, and it's working. We already have over 500 kids that are presently in the program.
One of the areas, and I discussed it with Mohammed Noor, that I've been interested in is the area of regulation, which you talked about. You talked about regulation protecting rich people. But what about just regulation in general? We had the minority leader, I think his name is Kurt Dowd, maybe I'm mispronouncing his name, up here and saying that there are a lot of duplicative efforts, that you've got to go through multiple places to get zoning permits and certain permits, and it's just not a rational process. And so a lot of the one way to do this is you put a lot of money into homes, and you want to put money into solving some of the public challenges in homes. The other side is just the ease of it in kind of looking at the regulatory dimension in terms of the costs and the barriers to actually providing the kind of housing you want to have out there. Is there any kind of review you're doing of that element?
Compared with other cities, we actually have a relatively quick process for project approval. And frankly, because we have a state law that says within 60 days of an application, the city must act, and you can do one extension for a total of 120 days.
Right.
What's changing is that we used to have more of a kind of informal process before a project would submit its application, and that would be it would really depend on who's the council member or what neighborhood the project was in. And so I think one of the best things about Minneapolis 2040 in my mind is that because it has this new built form map, because it has very specific regulations citywide, it's creating more transparency, more fairness, and more predictability. So I think going along with that, and what you'll hear critics say, is that it's making it too easy to develop. So I think in order to really deliver on the other promises we've made to our community, that we're going to deliver affordable housing, that we're fighting climate change, through all these different actions, we are looking at ways to really, add inclusionary zoning, which will require affordable units in new projects. We're looking at green building standards. We're looking at how to leverage private investment for public transportation or transportation systems that we need to support that growth. And we are a bit limited by state law in a lot of those areas of how we might leverage private investment for the public good.
One of the things I've been, one of my personal obsessions is how do communities reinvent themselves. A few years ago, I came to Minneapolis with Steve Case. I don't know if many of you know Steve Case, the founder of America Online, and he's got something called Rise of the Rest. He took Mike Huckabee's old campaign bus and painted it, and he kind of took this bus around Midwest cities and went to startup zones, people that were doing startups. And so I rode on this bus for 5 days with Steve, and one of the places we're here, and we saw this incredible market, I don't know where it is, somewhere in your city, of entrepreneurs from all over, many Somali entrepreneurs, and I think it's food and crafts and all sorts of stuff. But I guess one of the things I became interested in are how communities find that spark to reinvent themselves. Part of it is creating a lifestyle and space where innovators and young, next generation innovators want to be. And part of it is looking at some of the things that you were just talking about, the various dimensions. And the LEED folks that do LEED certification of buildings are now doing LEED communities. And that is like transportation, it's quality of life, it's inclusion, it's intergenerational, deals. Is there any of that going on in Minneapolis?
Yes, and actually that is a huge part of the 2040 plan. We are believers in beautiful socioeconomic and housing diversity in every corner of the city. We are believers that when you have 1,000 different backgrounds and mentalities and ideas at the table, or in your case, I'm assuming it was the Midtown Global Market that you went to.
Yes, yeah, it's so cool. I love that. I want to go there now.
It's spectacular. The food is amazing, the crafts, everything. But that's when great entrepreneurship takes place, and that's ultimately when our city is going to really rock. But in order to get that beautiful socioeconomic diversity throughout the city, you first have to allow for it. And for generations after generations, we didn't allow for it because we set a system up so that really, unless you were able to, build a very large home on a very large plot, you couldn't live in huge quadrants of the city. And so what the 2040 plan did and is doing is ensuring that we can have a housing diversity throughout the city. So not just single family homes, but duplexes or triplexes, and along commercial corridors we can get higher density to allow for, in some cases, affordable housing to go there. Will that necessarily mean that affordable housing will be there? No, but it allows for it, where previously, in many cases, was prevented.
Lisa, you seemed interested in the LEED part of this. Are you working with the LEED folks at all?
We are working to try to create a new building code that would allow for much more stretching of green building requirements. This is a state law barrier. So in the interim, until we're able to change state law, we're looking at incentivizing green building features along the lines of LEED or other scoring.
And I'm interested, when you're watching every single, data point in a city and kind of watching, I'm interested in what you pay most attention to see whether you're making progress. When do you see you're failing? Or Mike Rawlings, the mayor of Dallas, somebody I've interviewed a couple of times, and the first time I interviewed him, I sort of accidentally embarrassed him because I said, are you a data mayor? Do you have a dashboard and do you have an app for your city that shows, Rahm Emanuel did, Mike Bloomberg did, Eric Garcetti in Los Angeles did, where if you could look at various features of the city, from crime to fires to whatever. So Mike Rawlings, the second time we interviewed him from Dallas, got a data, he had people to sign it, and then he showed me, he pulled out his notebook and said, here are all the issues. And the issue that was most important to him, he said, was real estate values in South Dallas. So he said if he saw real estate values in South Dallas rising, he knew he was doing his job, because he was getting the gravity to work differently, to embrace this community, look at it as a place to invest and to be in. So I'm interested in whether, one, are you folks driven by data, and what are the data that matter most as you're trying to succeed in this housing crisis?
Yeah, I think we're getting there with data. I mean,
You have a dashboard?
we have several dashboards.
Maybe next
We
time we get
one
together,
dashboard.
yeah.
For me, I would say right now around housing, my biggest question is around residential displacement. The number of evictions we're seeing, the number of naturally occurring affordable housing units that we have and where they are, and how much rent is rising. That is what our community is feeling the most pressure around.
Mayor?
Well, I think we're experiencing the exact opposite dynamic as what you were explaining in Dallas, because, when you have a neighborhood that is seeing underinvestment, you look to see, the investment go and the values increase. Now, we're seeing the exact opposite issue, whereas a whole lot of people want to live in Minneapolis right now. A whole lot of people want to live in and around the downtown core, and when you have demand that's sky high, but you don't have the supply to accommodate, the dynamic the council president just discussed starts happening, which is people begin getting displaced, and that is most definitely happening in our city.
Well, with Mohammed, maybe the data point is slowing rent increases, citizen. I mean, it may be in everything. Opportunity zones are also getting a lot of attention nationally now, and for those of you who don't know, this is was created in the Trump tax code that passed, and it allows very wealthy people to invest in what are considered to be distressed areas. But it's become very controversial that people are looking at this as sort of a giveaway to the rich, not achieving the purposes. How are opportunities zones going for the greater Minneapolis area?
I think the truth is we don't really know, because that program isn't a program per se, it's just an investment tool. And we had a map come to us very last minute, we made some changes. Frankly, I think the city of Minneapolis probably should have just said no, or maybe even more severely constricted the places where we said it was okay. Cities around the country don't have any tools to guide how opportunity investments happen, and so because we don't even know which projects have that funding or not, it's a financing tool, of course. So for us to be able to leverage that investment in a way that stops displacement isn't possible.
So you're not a fan?
I'm not a fan.
You agree?
I think Council President's right. We don't know. The rules weren't gotten to us until very late in the game. We couldn't figure out exactly how the ownership structures would work. And if this is simply a matter of investing a whole lot of money, increasing the value, and displacing the people that made these corridors and neighborhoods wonderful to begin with, it's not a good strategy. Now, we're trying to flip that whole dynamic on its head through a concept called cultural districts or cultural corridors, which is where we're directly investing in properties. We're allowing communities that are there to invest in the properties so that they can secure ownership and start building intergenerational wealth. And this is specifically geared towards communities of color.
I want to go to the audience just a minute, but with the last, there's a gentleman over here who's got his hand up already, yay, but not yet. I was impressed in the preamble to what I read about Minneapolis 2040, in that you're very self-conscious and seem to be aware of the legacy of discrimination and of people because of ethnicity and race being left out. I remember Anthony Fox, who was the Secretary of Transportation, kind of gave me a lesson with various cities and looking at where freeways went on and freeway off-ramps went on, and how communities that were divided, and you reinforced this patterns, often racial patterns. And we had and you mentioned race. So I know that undoing that is a very big part of Minneapolis 2040, but it's one thing to say it and say that's a goal, it's another thing to do it. How do you really do it?
Yeah, this is where I don't think any city has really achieved this goal, right? And so for us, all of the support for Minneapolis 2040 came from our community. It came from housing advocates, for race justice advocates, for folks advocating for more sustainable and equitable transportation systems. So the way it will happen is the community will hold elected officials accountable over time.
Right.
And we have to be really careful. It's easier to change the zoning code to make it easier to develop housing than it is to figure out how to build community wealth in neighborhoods that have been disinvested for 100 years.
Right.
And so we have to make sure that before we do the deregulation part, before we make it easier to develop, that we are intentionally engaging our community, that we're creating the right tools. I think we just have to really hold ourselves accountable, and that will come from the community.
Jacob, do you have thoughts? Because you're from D.C. originally, so D.C. is also I think Mayor Bowser right now in Washington is doing a pretty phenomenal job, actually, from my perspective, of creating opportunities in parts that had been completely neglected and left out before. But I'm just sort of interested in how you actually, where you put the muscle to kind of undo some of these divides.
You first have to start looking at the history. And we have a history in Minneapolis where we literally have maps going back 100 of years that designate North Minneapolis as a slum for blacks and Jews. We then had restrictive covenants that ran with the land and intentional
The maps
segregation.
actually said that?
They did. And by the way, Minneapolis is not unique in that setup. There are cities throughout the country that have prescriptively segregated out communities, and once it became illegal through the Civil Rights Act to do some of those things explicitly, we then started doing it implicitly through a zoning code and through other forms of regulation. And so right now we're trying to make sure that the precision of our solutions now match the precision of the harm that was initially inflicted.
Thank you. Let me go to you. Yes, we have this gentleman right here. And then
Thank you. So I think we oftentimes talk about the effects of the housing crisis without talking about the other side, the people who are creating the conditions.
Sure.
In this time of out-of-control income disparity and extraction, which leads to the Twin Cities being ranked fourth for its place Black Americans, in your view, who in the private sector has profited the most off of this housing crisis? And if you can be as explicit and specific as possible to Minneapolis, that'd be helpful.
it's great. This is like my villains and heroes question, so thank you so much. Yes. So who's winning out of this mess?
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that. I don't. I mean, and perhaps you've got a specific entity or a specific industry that has profited the most. I mean, certainly going into the crash of 2008, it was banks and financial institutions and mortgage fraud that was creating a whole lot of the mess. I'm not clear on it in terms of a dollar figure who has profited the most since then, though. I think that would be accurate, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just briefly add to that. I mean, I think we're a city that's more than 50% renter, and so just the bottom line is anyone who owns property in any community that has a shortage is profiting, is gaining and benefiting. And from there, of course, as the mayor mentioned, all the institutions that had invested and profited from the housing crisis, which explicitly exploited low-income people of color. And that continues. And now we're seeing the landlords in our community. We have, thousands and thousands of folks who own rental property. Many of them live in their, many of them are duplexes. They live in them. We have lots of folks who care about their tenants, but as an industry is very unregulated in a lot of ways, and there's very little protection for renters in Minnesota in particular.
That's right.
I have an answer for you, but I'll wait. Oh, yes, right here, yes. Thank you.
So you all are here because of the 2040 plan that kind of gives a focus to Minneapolis. One of my problems with the 2040 plan is that it's like the family who has a plan to build an addition to their house and do all manner of good things, but doesn't have the money to do it. This discussion is fundamentally about money and where it goes. So there's $40 million coming in. That's a drop in the bucket. The
Right.
federal money isn't coming anytime soon. And changing people's income from $12 an hour to $15 is not going to solve anything. So I want to know where the plan in Minneapolis is coming from to have major money come into the city so we can afford all this stuff.
Good question. Where does the money come from to pay for the plan?
The money is
gonna
coming
ask
from
that
a
if you had
variety
10 more minutes.
first let me say, if the argument is that $40 million in city investment coupled with the state and federal tax credits that we're getting, coupled with all of the other work from $15 an hour to earn sick and safe time to our 2040 comprehensive plan. If you're arguing that that is not enough to correct some of the injustices, you're right. You won't find any argument from us there. We haven't reached that point yet. But does a difficulty in reaching the ultimate goal, does that inhibit us from doing the work to get there? No, we still have to be trudging along that path down the road to ultimately get some sort of conclusion that quite simply helps people, because that's what government does. And I am proud that, the things that we, mayor and city council have done over the last several years, they are going to make a difference. And they were tough, and a lot of them are controversial, but they are going to make a difference. And I think that if we can kind of set the tone, if we can kind of be that beacon of inclusivity and hope and opportunity, hopefully we see much of the rest of the country follow along.
And we just
we're right at the end. I apologize, we're at the end. So
we cannot accept as a reality that all of the pressure of disinvestment falls to cities. We cannot accept as a reality that states and the federal government are going to walk away from housing and other public investment. We are taxing low-income renters to reinvest in our community. We're maxing out on how much we can really gather from local property taxes, which is the major tool that we have. So we have to demand more from state and federal government.
And that's exactly right.
Where is the economic development plan for the city of Minneapolis?
So we have an economic development plan through the city of Minneapolis, both through community planning and economic development department, and we have another person that does that work in my office. And we are seeing the economy grow substantially. The economy right now in Minneapolis and actually in the region is not doing badly. In fact, we are creating way more jobs than we have people to fill them. The most recent statistic showed that we had somewhere in the range of 160,000 job vacancies in the Twin Cities region, and so we have the jobs, the economy is growing, the money is coming in, but as was pointed out, property taxes, which is a regressive form of taxation, can't be the exclusive tool from which we use resources.
So I need to bring it there. I just want to say, you raised a very important question for the camera that did not hear it. You asked about where's the economic development plan to go with Minneapolis. And I think it's a legitimate, interesting question. Yeah. To this gentleman over here, I just want to say in my chairman role of this, we've got to end this, unfortunately, right now. I would go back to the 08-09 financial crisis, which has come up, and one of the missed opportunities that I've written about at the Hill and elsewhere is at that moment when people were being moved out of their homes because of foreclosures, there was an incredible public policy failure there. That there were ways to work with financial institutions, there were ways to adjust policy rules to keep people in their homes, and at that moment, we had heard both from minority leader, from a lot of people, there was a policy failure. This is now recovering from that. I want to thank you both for spending time with us, Mayor, Madam President. Thank you so much for joining us this morning here in your city, and good luck with the projects.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.